Hi, I'm James. A few days before my brother's lavish wedding, he called me, with my parents on the line, to make sure I wouldn't embarrass the family by showing up in some cheap army surplus rag. He said it with a laugh, but it wasn't a joke. It was a final, crushing reminder of my place in their world. I just stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence that followed. That silence was louder than any insult he could have ever thrown at me. It's amazing how the people who are supposed to build you up can be the ones to tear you down the most, isn't it? Have you ever felt completely erased by your own family? Before I tell you what happened when I walked into that wedding reception, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the look on their faces when they finally saw who I really was. My brother, Kevin, was the golden boy. Always has been. He was the one who went to a fancy business school, landed a high-paying job right out of college, and now ran his own successful consulting firm. He had the sprawling house in a gated community, the sleek black Mercedes in the driveway, and a different luxury watch for every day of the week. Our parents talked about him like he was a king, and me, I was the disappointment, the one who threw his life away to join the army. They imagined me scrubbing floors or peeling potatoes on some forgotten base, a directionless kid playing soldier. They never asked what I actually did. They didn't want to know. It was easier for them to fit me into the neat little box they'd built. Kevin, the success, James, the failure. That was the story, and they were sticking to it. I remember one Christmas, just a couple of years back, the whole family was gathered at my parents' house. Kevin had just pulled up in his brand new Porsche, the engine rumbling like a caged animal. He tossed the keys onto the counter and made a big show of taking off his Rolex, placing it carefully beside them. My dad couldn't stop talking about the car's horsepower, and my mum was gushing over how handsome Kevin looked in his tailored suit. I was sitting there in jeans and a simple polo shirt, having just gotten back from a deployment I couldn't talk about. They asked me if I was still enjoying my little army job, and if the food was any good on the base. It was like I was a child reporting back from summer camp, not a grown man serving his country. I felt like a ghost at my own family's table, completely invisible. The worst part was never Kevin's loud, obnoxious bragging. I got used to that. The worst part was my parents' quiet approval of it all. They'd just smile and nod, their eyes shining with pride as he belittled me. They never once stepped in, never once said, Kevin, that's enough." Their silence was their endorsement. It was a clear message. He was right, and I was wrong. My choices were a source of shame for them, while his were a source of glory. He built his empire on spreadsheets and conference calls, and they saw a titan of industry. I led men in situations they couldn't possibly imagine, and they saw a janitor in a uniform. The gap between their perception and my reality was a canyon, and I had long ago stopped trying to build a bridge across it. It was just too exhausting. Every phone call, every holiday visit, was another layer of humiliation. Kevin would talk about closing a multi-million-dollar deal, and my mom would ask me if I'd saved up enough to buy a decent car. Yet, he'd announce he was buying a vacation home in Aspen, and my dad would pat me on the shoulder and say, "Don't worry, son, you'll find your way eventually." They treated me like I was perpetually lost, a charity case they had to endure. They had no idea that the little army job they scorned had given me a purpose and a level of responsibility that Kevin, or with all his money, would never understand. I was in charge of the lives of over 100 men. I made decisions that had real, immediate consequences. But in their eyes, I was still the little brother who needed to grow up and get a real job. So when that call came, it wasn't exactly a surprise. It was just the final, sharpest twist of the knife. Kevin was on speakerphone, his voice dripping with that familiar, smug condescension. "Hey, Jimmy," he started, using the childhood nickname I hated, "just calling about the wedding. We're all really excited. Listen, about your outfit. Mom and I were talking, and we'd really appreciate it if you made an effort. You know, buy a decent suit for once in your life. We don't want you showing up in some cheap army surplus rag and scaring the guests." He laughed, a short, barking sound that held no humor. I could hear my mum's faint breathing on the line, my dad clearing his throat. They were right there, listening to their successful son tell their failure of a son how to dress, so he wouldn't be an embarrassment. I waited for one of them to speak up, for my mum to say, "Kevin, be nice," for my dad to say, "He's a grown man, he knows how to dress." I just waited. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with everything they weren't saying. It was filled with their agreement, their shared opinion that I was a problem to be managed. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just Kevin. It was all of them. They were a united front. My brother was the voice, but they were the silent partners in my humiliation. That silence was the nail in the coffin of whatever hope I had left for our relationship. It confirmed everything I had always suspected. I wasn't just the black sheep. I was an outsider they tolerated out of a sense of familial obligation. Nothing more. Something inside me didn't break. It froze. The hot, familiar sting of anger and shame was replaced by a sudden, chilling calm. It was a clarity I hadn't felt before. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to defend myself. What was the point? Arguing with them was like shouting into the wind. They had their narrative, and no amount of truth from me was ever going to change it. So I just said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "Don't worry, Kevin. I'll make sure I'm appropriately dressed. I wouldn't want to cause a scene." He grunted a satisfied good, and after a few more awkward pleasantries, we hung up. I stood there in my small, sparse apartment off base, the phone still in my hand, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The war for their approval was over. I had lost, but a new battle had just begun. The battle for my own dignity. They thought they were talking to a low-level grunt, some kid who spent his days polishing boots and following orders without question. They had no idea who I had become. They didn't know about the commendations, the promotions, the immense weight of the command I held. They didn't know the man my soldiers saw every day, the man they trusted with their lives. My family saw a failure, but my men saw a leader. And as I started to make the necessary arrangements for the wedding, I decided it was finally time for my family to meet the man my men already knew. I wasn't going to say a word. I was just going to show them. The wedding wasn't going to be a celebration of Kevin's success anymore. It was going to be the final chapter of a story they thought they had already written for me. The days leading up to the wedding were a strange kind of purgatory. I went through the motions of my duties on base. The familiar rhythm of command, a welcome distraction from the buzzing anger in my chest. But in the quiet moments, in my apartment at night, the silence from that phone call would come rushing back. It was an active, malevolent thing. It wasn't just the absence of defense for me. It was the presence of their complete and total agreement with Kevin, my own parents. They had stood by, metaphorically nodding, as their son was branded an embarrassment. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I'd spent years overseas, in places they couldn't find on a map, making decisions that meant life or death, only to come home and be treated like a wayward teenager who couldn't be trusted to pick out his own clothes. I kept replaying other moments, a highlight reel of a lifetime of being second best. I remembered my high school graduation. Kevin had just closed his first big deal and bought himself a brand new BMW. He made sure to park it right out front. My entire graduation party became the Kevin's new car show. My father, who had barely said 2 words about my diploma, spent an hour in the driveway with his friends, talking about the engine and the leather interior. My mother kept bringing people out to see it, saying, "Isn't he something? So driven." I stood there in my cap and gown, holding a piece of paper that represented 12 years of work, and I felt completely invisible. I wasn't their son who had just graduated. I was just the excuse for a party where they could celebrate their other, better son. That feeling, that sense of being background noise in my own life, had never really gone away. This time, though, something was different. The humiliation wasn't turning into shame. It was crystallizing into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't about getting revenge. Revenge was messy and emotional, and I was done being emotional about them. This was about a correction, a realignment of a reality they had spent my entire life distorting. I made a single phone call to my master sergeant, a man named Davis who had been with me through 2 deployments. He was a rock, a man whose quiet competence could stop a freight train. I didn't give him the whole story. I didn't need to. "Sergeant," I said, "I have a personal request. I need a small contingent for a formal event this Saturday. Dress uniform, volunteers only." There was no hesitation. "How many men do you need, sir?" That was it. No questions, no judgment. Just loyalty, the kind of loyalty my own blood had never once shown me. Later that evening, I pulled my uniform from the garment bag in my closet. the army service uniform. The deep blue jacket, the light blue trousers, the crisp white shirt. It wasn't a costume. It was my life. It was every pre-dawn run, every endless training exercise, every moment of gut-wrenching fear, and every ounce of courage I had to find to overcome it. I laid the jacket on my bed and began affixing the decorations, my fingers tracing each one. The silver star, from a firefight in a dusty village whose name they'd never know. The bronze stars with the V for valor. The purple heart. Each pin, each ribbon, was a chapter in a book they had never even tried to open. They saw a cheap army surplus rag, but I saw the story of who I had become, written in silk and metal, and for the first time, I felt a profound sense of peace about showing it to them. For a brief moment, standing there in my quiet apartment, a wave of doubt washed over me. Was this just a childish stunt? Was I stooping to Kevin's level, engaging in a different kind of ostentatious display? The thought was unsettling. I'd always prided myself on being above the petty games my family played, but then I looked at the uniform again, at the flag on the right sleeve, and I knew this was different. Kevin's wealth was about what he had bought. My uniform was about what I had earned. His status was given to him by a market. Mine was bestowed by a nation, paid for in sweat and blood, not just my own, but that of the men I served with. This wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up. It was about walking into that room as the man I truly was, not the caricature they had created. This was for me. It was my declaration of independence. The day before the wedding, I was checking in with the men who had volunteered, 10 of them all leaders within my unit, one of them a young sergeant named Miller, a kid I'd seen grow from a nervous private into a confident NCO, pulled me aside. "Sir, you sure about this? My cousin had one of these fancy weddings. A lot of people in tuxes looking down their noses at everyone. He was trying to look out for me, to protect his commander from a different kind of battlefield." I put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sure, Sergeant," I told him. "It's just something I have to do to close a chapter." He just nodded, that simple, profound gesture of understanding that I had come to value more than gold. "We've got your back, sir," he said. And I knew he meant it. That short, simple exchange meant more to me than any hollow "I love you" I'd ever heard from my parents. On the morning of the wedding, I didn't feel nervous. I felt calm, methodical. I went through the process of getting dressed with the same precision I would before a mission. I shaved until my skin was smooth. I tied my tie, ensuring the knot was perfect. I polished the brass on my belt and the toes of my low quarters until I could see my reflection. Each step was a ritual, grounding me in the reality of the moment. When I finally stood before the full-length mirror, I didn't see the family failure. I didn't see Jimmy. I saw Major James Carter, United States Army. The uniform didn't feel like a disguise. It felt like my own skin. It was the truest version of myself. The person I was when no one from my old life was watching. Today, they would finally see him. The drive to the country club felt like crossing into enemy territory. It was one of those places designed to make people feel poor, with sprawling green golf courses and fountains that probably cost more than my car. Kevin's world, a world built on a foundation of expensive handshakes and a carefully curated image. As I passed through the ornate iron gates, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of detachment. I didn't want any of this. I wasn't jealous of the Mercedes and Porsches in the parking lot or the mansion I knew my brother was so proud of. I felt a strange sort of pity for him. He had chased this manufactured version of success his whole life, and in doing so, he had missed out on anything real. His relationships were transactions. His happiness was measured in quarterly earnings. My world was brutal, but it was honest. His was polished, but it was hollow. I parked in a spot far from the entrance and met my men. They were already there, standing together, a small island of discipline in a sea of luxury vehicles. 10 soldiers in immaculate dress uniforms. They looked powerful, not intimidating but solid, unbreakable. They were the physical embodiment of real strength, a stark contrast to the soft, unearned power that filled the ballroom ahead. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. A few shared nods. "Air quiet, ready, sir," from Sergeant Davis. They knew this wasn't an official duty. They were here for me, as men, as brothers. Their presence was my armor. With them standing with me, the judgment of the crowd inside seemed insignificant. like the buzzing of a fly in a hurricane. We were a unit, moving with a single purpose. Just as we were about to walk toward the building, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "James, where are you? The ceremony is about to start. Please don't be late. I hope you found a nice suit." The words were so casual, so oblivious. The casual condescension, the assumption that I was, as always, on the verge of letting them down. She had no idea. She was worried about my suit, while I was standing in a parking lot with men who had trusted me with their lives. I looked at the phone, then at the determined faces of my soldiers. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I typed back a short reply. "On my way. Don't worry, I'm dressed for the occasion." I put the phone away. There was nothing more to say. The time for words was over. We walked in formation toward the grand entrance of the ballroom, our polished shoes clicking in unison on the stone walkway. I could hear the muffled sounds of a string quartet, the murmur of polite laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses. It was the soundtrack to a world I had never belonged to. I took a deep, steadying breath. This wasn't an invasion, it was a revelation. I wasn't there to start a war, but to finally, definitively, end one. The one that had been fought inside my own head for 26 years. I gave a final, almost imperceptible nod to Sergeant Davis. He understood. We would wait. We would find our seats, blend in as much as 10 soldiers in dress uniform could, and we would wait for the perfect moment. We would wait for the toast. The moment when Kevin, the king in his castle, would inevitably try to remind everyone of his little brother's place, and that's when the truth would arrive. We walked through the grand oak doors, and the world seemed to stop for a fraction of a second. The sound of the string quartet faltered for a beat. A wave of scented air, a mix of expensive perfume and floral arrangements, washed over us. It was a scene of calculated opulence. Ice sculptures of swans melted slowly on linen-covered tables, and a chandelier the size of a small car dripped crystal light onto the polished dance floor. Dozens of heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. They saw 11 men in dark blue uniforms, moving with a quiet purpose that didn't belong in that room. For a moment, I saw the scene through their eyes. We were an anomaly, a disruption to their perfect, curated fantasy. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, not with hostility, but with a blank, confused curiosity, as if we were performers who had mistaken our stage. We found our assigned table without a word. As I suspected, it was tucked in the back corner, near the kitchens, a physical representation of my place in their family hierarchy. The centerpiece was smaller than the others, an afterthought. My place card didn't say Major James Carter, it just said Jimmy. The casual, diminutive nickname felt like a final, petty jab. I looked across the vast room to the head table, a long elevated dais draped in white silk. I could see my parents, beaming with a pride so bright it was almost painful to look at. My father was laughing at something Kevin's new father-in-law, a real estate mogul, had said. My mother was adjusting the veil on her new daughter-in-law's head. They were completely absorbed in their perfect world, utterly oblivious to the son they had relegated to the shadows. It was a familiar feeling, but seeing it laid out so starkly in this grand ballroom made it feel colder and more final than ever before. The ceremony itself was a blur of practiced vows and polite applause. I watched my brother standing at the altar, looking every bit the successful tycoon in his custom-tailored tuxedo. I tried to feel something, nostalgia, brotherly affection, even sadness, but there was nothing, just a profound and hollow distance. I remembered a time, long ago when we were just kids playing in the dirt behind our old house, before the world had taught us to measure our worth in dollars and job titles. He was just Kevin, and I was just James. When did that change? When did he start seeing me as a rival to be beaten? A failure to be pitied? I watched him slip a diamond ring onto his bride's finger, a ring that probably cost more than my entire salary for a year, and I knew that boy I remembered was long gone, buried under a mountain of ambition and arrogance. At one point during the endless procession of readings and songs, I felt a gaze on me. I looked up and met my mother's eyes from across the room. She was squinting slightly, a small frown line appearing between her perfectly manicured eyebrows. From that distance, she couldn't make out the details of my uniform, the medals, the rank insignia. She just saw a group of men in dark, formal attire. Her expression wasn't one of recognition or warmth. It was a look of mild annoyance and of confusion. A who are they and why are they here kind of look. She gave a tight, dismissive little smile, the kind you give a stranger who catches your eye, and then she turned back to the ceremony, her attention once again fully on her golden son. That fleeting glance, that moment of non-recognition, said everything. I wasn't her son in that moment. I was just a strange guest at her other son's party. As the reception got underway, the atmosphere shifted. The string quartet was replaced by a live band playing smooth jazz, and waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. My men and I remained at our table, a quiet, disciplined island in a sea of boisterous celebration. We were a curiosity. I could hear the whispers, see the sideways glances. Are they with the band? Maybe they're security for the father-in-law. The assumptions were telling. They couldn't conceive of a reality where someone in my family, someone at this wedding, was a soldier. To them, the military was an abstract concept, something for other people's sons from other, poorer neighborhoods. It wasn't something that belonged in their world of country clubs and trust funds. We sat there, patiently, letting their curiosity build, letting the tension in the room coil just a little tighter with every whispered question. Eventually, the inevitable happened. My Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother, and a man who measured his own worth by how close he could stand to Kevin's success, ambled over to our table. He was flushed from champagne, his tie already loosened. "Jimmy, there you are," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "We were wondering if you'd make it. Kevin told us you were having a tough go of it on that base, but hey, you clean up all right?" He winked, then gestured vaguely at my men. "Brought the whole platoon, huh? Don't worry. The open bar is on Kevin." His words were slurred, but his condescension was crystal clear. He was performing for the nearby tables, reinforcing the family narrative. I was the charity case, the down-on-his-luck brother who needed a free meal and a pat on the head. I could feel the heat rise in my neck, the familiar sting of public humiliation. But before I could even form a response, something shifted. Sergeant Davis, sitting to my right, didn't look at my uncle. He just straightened his back, his posture becoming ramrod straight. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it was electric. One by one, down the line, every one of my men did the same. They didn't speak, they didn't glare, they simply sat at attention, their presence suddenly filling the space around our table with an immense, unspoken weight. The air grew thick and still. Uncle Frank's jovial, drunken smile faltered. He looked from one stony face to the next, the condescension draining from his expression, replaced by a sudden, confused discomfort. He wasn't looking at Jimmy's friends anymore. He was looking at something he didn't understand, something that made him feel small and foolish. "Well, you boys enjoy it," he mumbled, backing away from the table as if it were radioactive. The dynamic had changed. We were no longer just being watched. We were being felt. Next came the speeches. The best man, a slick-haired partner from Kevin's firm named Todd, took the microphone. His speech was a predictable mix of fawning praise and inside jokes about hostile takeovers and weekend trips on a private jet to Vegas. The crowd ate it up. Then, he turned his attention toward me. "And of course, we can't forget the groom's little brother, James," he said, mispronouncing my name. "Kevin always told us you took a different path. While we were closing deals, you were, well, I'm sure someone's got to make sure the country's mess halls are running on time." A round of applause for Jimmy. Everyone. A smattering of polite, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room. The insult was so casual, so deeply ingrained in their worldview, that they didn't even see it as cruel. It was just a fact to them. I was the help. I could feel every eye in that ballroom settle on me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to shrink. I didn't give them one. I simply picked up my glass of water and took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes never leaving the best man's face. My men remained absolutely motionless, their expressions unreadable, their disciplined stillness a stark rebuke to the cheap joke. My lack of reaction was more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. It created a vacuum. The awkward laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The best man, Todd, visibly faltered. He had expected me to look embarrassed, to maybe offer a weak, self-deprecating smile. My calm defiance unnerved him. He stammered, lost his place in his notes. and quickly wrapped up his speech with a mumbled cheers to Kevin and Tiffany. He practically fled the stage. The tension in the room was no longer just a subtle undercurrent, it was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. The guests knew something was happening, even if they didn't know what it was. Finally, it was Kevin's turn. He strode to the microphone, grabbing it with the easy confidence of a man who owned the world. He was glowing, his face flushed with victory. He thanked his new in-laws for their generous contribution to the wedding, thanked his bride for being the perfect accessory to his perfect life, and thanked his parents for always believing in him. Then, his eyes found me in the back corner. That familiar smug smirk spread across his face. "And I've got to give a special shout-out to my little brother, Jimmy," he said into the mic, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "He made it. Mom and I were a little worried you'd show up in your work clothes, but look at you." He gestured toward me with his champagne flute. "You actually found a suit that fits. See, everyone, there's hope for him yet." The final nail, the ultimate humiliation delivered on the biggest stage of his life for all to see. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The wait was over. This was the moment. As his words echoed through the silent ballroom, a strange thing happened. The anger I had expected to feel, the familiar hot flush of shame, never came. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside me. In that moment, watching him stand there, so proud of his own casual cruelty, I didn't see my brother anymore. I saw a stranger, a small, insecure man who had to tear others down to feel tall. The last frayed thread connecting me to the hope of their approval finally snapped. A profound, almost peaceful calm washed over me. It was the calm of acceptance. The war was finally, truly over. I didn't need to fight them anymore. I just needed to show them who they had been fighting against all along. All the years of biting my tongue, of swallowing their insults, it all just evaporated. I was free. The room reacted exactly as I knew it would. A wave of uncomfortable laughter, led by Kevin's sycophantic business partners, rippled through the guests. I saw women in expensive dresses cover their mouths with their hands, whispering to their husbands. I saw men in tuxedos smirk, shaking their heads with a kind of pitying amusement. They were all in on the joke. I was the punchline, the court jester in their king's court. I could feel the weight of their collective judgment, the comfortable superiority of people who had never faced a day of real hardship in their lives. They saw me as Kevin had painted me, a failure, a charity case, a lost little boy playing dress-up, and for the first time in my life, their opinion felt completely and utterly irrelevant. It was like listening to the chatter of birds in a distant tree, just noise. My eyes drifted from the sea of anonymous judging faces to the head table. To my parents, my father was chuckling, a deep, rumbling sound, slapping the back of Kevin's father-in-law. My mother was smiling. Not a polite, strained smile, but a genuine, beaming smile of pure, unadulterated pride. She was proud of her son, the one with the microphone, the one who could so effortlessly humiliate his own brother in front of 200 people. There was no flicker of shame in her eyes, no hint of maternal protection, just adoration for the victor. That smile was the final confirmation. It was the period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. They weren't just bystanders to Kevin's cruelty. They were his most enthusiastic audience. They were his co-conspirators. Seeing that smile, I knew I was doing the right thing. I slowly, deliberately, turned my head and met the eyes of Master Sergeant Davis. He was sitting perfectly still, his gaze steady, waiting. He had been watching me, not Kevin, this entire time. He knew this was more than just a family dinner. He knew the weight this moment carried. I didn't have to say a word. I didn't have to make a grand gesture. I just gave him a single, slow nod. It was the same kind of nod I had given him on a dusty rooftop in Kandahar right before we moved on a target, a nod that said everything. It said, execute. It said, now. It said, it's time. He understood immediately. His expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, unwavering loyalty. The kind of loyalty that can't be bought with a luxury car or a corner office, the kind that is forged in fire. The effect of that single nod was instantaneous, though nearly invisible to the rest of the room. Sergeant Davis shifted his weight in his chair, a minute adjustment of posture that squared his shoulders and straightened his spine. Down the length of our table, as if connected by an invisible wire, 10 other men did the exact same thing in perfect, silent unison. Their hands, which had been resting on their laps, moved to rest on their knees, palms down, their chins lifted by a fraction of an inch. It was the subtle, disciplined transition from at ease to attention. To the oblivious guests, it would have looked like nothing at all, but to anyone who knew what to look for, it was a sign. It was the quiet, coordinated preparation for action. A storm was gathering in the back corner of that ballroom, and no one even knew it was about to break. On stage, Kevin was basking in the glow of his own perceived wit, completely oblivious. He raised his champagne flute higher, a king addressing his subjects. "So let's all raise a glass," he announced, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. "To my little brother, Jimmy. May he finally find a job where he doesn't have to wear a costume." He paused for the expected laughter, which came right on cue, a little louder this time. He was a performer playing his greatest hits, and the crowd was eating it up. He had no idea that the entire dynamic of the room was about to be irrevocably altered. He was so focused on the spotlight he had created for himself that he couldn't see the real power that was silently assembling in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. His world, built on a foundation of mockery and money, was about to tremble. I kept my eyes locked on him, my expression unreadable. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were watching a scene from a movie. This wasn't personal anymore. It transcended family drama. This was about a fundamental conflict of values. His world was represented by the glittering chandelier above, all surface-level brilliance and fragile glass. My world was represented by the men at my table, forged from steel, their worth measured not in what they owned, but in what they were willing to sacrifice. The guests were starting to notice something was off. The laughter died down more quickly this time. A few people were looking back and forth between our silent, rigid table and the oblivious groom on the stage. A nervous, uncertain energy began to seep into the room, displacing the boisterous celebration. The air grew heavy with unspoken questions. In that final moment of silence, I thought about what this was really for. It wasn't to shame my parents or to get revenge on Kevin. They were beyond my reach, lost in their own shallow world. This was for the 10 men sitting with me. It was for Sergeant Miller, who had worried about me being humiliated. It was for Master Sergeant Davis, who had my back without ever needing an explanation. It was for every soldier I had ever led. I was their commander. My honor was their honor. Allowing myself to be publicly degraded while wearing the uniform that represented us all was not an option. This act wasn't about putting my family in their place. It was about showing my men, and myself, that the respect we had earned together, in the dust and the danger, was more real and more powerful than anything in this entire, glittering, hollow room. Sergeant Davis's hand, resting on his knee, made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It was a simple movement of his index finger, a signal we had used 100 times in the field. It was the final trigger. Every soldier at that table saw it. I saw their chests expand slightly as they took a silent, preparatory breath. The potential energy in that corner of the room was now a palpable force, a coiled spring of discipline and purpose. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it, a metallic tang on my tongue. The rest of the room felt it too, even if they couldn't name it. The nervous chatter died completely. Every eye was now on our table, then to Kevin, then back to us. They knew something was about to happen. They were finally paying attention. Kevin, finally sensing the shift in the room's energy, looked confused for a fraction of a second, but his ego quickly won out. He cleared his throat, ready to deliver his final line and cue the band. "Cheers!" he shouted into the microphone, thrusting his glass into the air. The photographer's flash popped, capturing his triumphant grin. The guests, uncertain but conditioned to follow, began to raise their own glasses. It was the perfect picture of his success, the climax of his carefully constructed life. But as the first notes from the band were about to sound, a different sound cut through the air, a sound so sharp, so powerful, and so utterly out of place in that ballroom that it seemed to stop time itself. It was the sound of 11 chairs scraping against the polished floor as my men rose to their feet, not as guests, but as soldiers. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute. 11 chairs scraping back in perfect jarring unison. The band, which had been poised to launch into a cheerful pop song, went silent. A woman near the front gasped, and somewhere in the back, a champagne flute slipped from a nervous hand and shattered on the marble floor. That tiny, sharp sound was the only thing that broke the sudden, profound silence that had fallen over the room. Every guest was frozen, a statue in a tuxedo or a silk dress, their eyes wide and fixed on the back of the room. They were looking at the 11 men who now stood at attention, a silent, unmovable wall of dark blue wool and polished brass. They weren't guests anymore. They were a presence. They stood perfectly still, their posture a testament to years of discipline that was utterly alien to this environment of soft luxury. They weren't looking at me, and they weren't looking at Kevin. Their eyes were fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, their expressions neutral, their hands resting lightly at their sides. They weren't threatening. They weren't angry. They were simply correct. Their collective stillness created a pocket of immense gravity in the room, pulling all the air and sound and attention toward them. They transformed our neglected corner table from the cheap seats into the center of the universe. They didn't have to say a word. Their disciplined silence was louder than any shout, a stark, powerful rebuke to the casual mockery that had just filled the air. Then, Master Sergeant Davis took a single, precise step away from the table. His movement was fluid, economical, and radiated a competence that made every other man in the room, with their soft hands and expensive watches, look like a boy. He turned 90 degrees to face me, his body perfectly aligned. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. 200 pairs of eyes, including Kevin's and my parents', were now locked on this man, this stranger who had, with a few simple movements, seized absolute command of a $200,000 wedding reception. He had become the focal point, the director of a scene no one had been expecting. The air crackled with a tension that was no longer just awkward. It was electric with anticipation and a dawning sense of profound significance. Sergeant Davis's voice, when it came, was not a yell. It was something far more powerful. It was a clear, controlled, and resonant command that sliced through the opulent air of the ballroom like a surgeon's scalpel. "Major on deck!" The words, crisp and formal, echoed slightly in the cavernous room. They were from a different world, a different language, a language of order, respect, and unshakable hierarchy. To the guests, the specific meaning might have been lost, but the intent was unmistakable. It was a formal announcement, a declaration of rank and presence, a demand for respect that was absolute and non-negotiable. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact, delivered with an authority that left no room for argument. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a silence of confusion, it was a silence of shock, absolute, jaw-dropping shock. The word "major" hung in the air, seeming to shimmer under the crystal chandelier. It was a title that simply did not compute in their world, and especially not in relation to me. I saw Kevin's best man, Todd, the one who'd made the joke about me working in a mess hall, physically recoil as if he'd been struck. The real estate mogul father-in-law, a man used to commanding every room he entered, looked small and bewildered. The guests were frozen in a tableau of disbelief, their minds furiously trying to reconcile the Jimmy from the joke with the major from the command. The two realities could not coexist, and the cognitive dissonance was a palpable force in the room. I watched the realization shatter across my brother's face. His triumphant, smug grin dissolved as if washed away by acid. His mouth fell open, the champagne flute tilting precariously in his hand. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from the unmoving soldiers to Sergeant Davis, and then finally, truly, to me. He was seeing me for the first time in his life, not the little brother, not the family failure, not the charity case. He was seeing the uniform, the rank on my shoulders, the rows of ribbons on my chest. He was seeing a man he did not know, a man of authority, a man who commanded the instant, unwavering respect of 10 other formidable men. In that instant, his entire world, a world where he was the king and I was the jester, crumbled into dust. Then, I let my gaze travel to the head table. My father's face was ashen. The jovial, back-slapping good humor was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed pallor. He looked lost, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an explanation, for some cue on how to react. But it was my mother's face that I will never forget. Her hand was pressed against her lips, her perfectly applied lipstick now a smudge of red against her pale skin. Her eyes were wide with a dawning horror. The pride she had felt for Kevin just moments before had curdled into a sickening mixture of shock and, I thought, a flicker of shame. She was finally seeing it. The cheap army surplus rag was the formal attire of a field-grade officer. The son she had allowed to be humiliated was a man of rank and honor. The truth had arrived, and it was devastating. I remained seated. I did not move. I did not speak. My power in that moment was absolute, and it was derived entirely from my stillness. I was the calm center of the hurricane that had just torn through the ballroom. I let the silence stretch, letting them all absorb the scene. I let them look, really look, at me. I let them see the gold oak leaf on my shoulders, the symbol of my rank. I let their eyes drift over the ribbons, the silver star, the bronze stars, the purple heart. They didn't know what any of them meant, but they could feel their weight. They could sense that each piece of colored silk and metal represented a story, a moment of consequence, far removed from their world of stock portfolios and country club memberships. They were symbols of a reality they had never bothered to acknowledge, and now that reality was demanding their attention, after what felt like an eternity, I finally rose to my feet. I moved slowly, with the deliberation that commanded every eye in the room. I didn't look at my brother, who still stood frozen on the stage like a statue of his own failure. I didn't look at my parents, who were staring at me as if I were a ghost. I looked directly at my men. I looked at Master Sergeant Davis, and I gave him a single, slow, formal nod. It was a nod of command, of gratitude, of dismissal. It was a communication that excluded everyone else in the room. It was a silent affirmation of where my allegiance lay, of who my real family was. It was a gesture that said more clearly than any words, "Thank you, I'm okay, as you were." Sergeant Davis returned the nod with a crisp, infinitesimal movement of his head. Then he turned, and as one, he and the other 10 men sat down. Their movements were again in perfect silent unison. The sound of their chairs meeting the floor was the only sound in the vast, silent room. The entire event, the rising, the command, the recognition, the sitting had taken less than a minute, but in those seconds everything had changed. The power dynamic of my entire life had been inverted. The narrative my family had so carefully crafted had been utterly and irrevocably destroyed. The band remained silent. The guests remained frozen. The party was over. The silence that remained was heavy with the weight of unspoken things. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of consequence. It was filled with Kevin's public humiliation, with my parents' dawning shame, and with the uncomfortable realization of 200 wealthy guests that they had laughed at the wrong man. I stood there for a moment longer, a solitary figure in a uniform they now understood, and I felt a profound sense of release. I hadn't come for revenge, I had come for the truth, and as I looked at the wreckage of their perfect, curated world, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the truth had finally been delivered. Without another glance at the head table, I turned my back on the wreckage. I walked toward the grand oak doors, my steps measured and even. My men remained seated, a silent honor guard watching me go. The room was a vacuum, all the air sucked out of it. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps on the polished marble floor. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on my back, a physical weight, but it was no longer the weight of judgment. It was the weight of awe, confusion, and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. I had already said everything I needed to say without uttering a single word. The walk out of that ballroom was the longest and shortest walk of my life. It was the final steps away from a life that was never truly mine. As I passed the tables, people physically shrank back in their chairs, averting their gazes as if looking at me was a transgression. They stared down at their expensive plates of untouched food or into their champagne glasses. The confidence and casual superiority had evaporated, replaced by a nervous deference. They didn't know who I was, but they knew I wasn't the joke my brother had made me out to be. I was something else. Something from a world they didn't understand. A world with consequences far more real than a fluctuating stock price. I passed the table where my Uncle Frank had been holding court, and he looked pale and sober, his eyes wide and fixed on his water glass. The power had shifted, and everyone in that room felt the tectonic change. I was no longer the outsider they were. I didn't look toward the head table as I approached the exit, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel my mother's horrified stare, my father's dumbfounded gaze, my brother's shattered disbelief. No one moved. No one called out my name. Kevin remained on the stage, a statue of a groom whose perfect day had just been publicly dismantled. My parents were frozen at their table, trapped between the image they had built and the reality that had just walked past them. Their silence, which had once been my tormentor, was now their prison. There were no words they could say to fix this, no apology that could bridge the chasm that had just opened at their feet. They had made their choice long ago, and now they were left to sit with the consequences of it in a room full of silent witnesses. When I stepped outside into the cool evening air, my men were already there, having slipped out a side door. They were standing in formation by my car, waiting. There was no celebration, no backslapping, just a quiet, profound solidarity. Master Sergeant Davis stepped forward. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I looked at his face, at the faces of the other men standing behind him, and I felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost buckled my knees. These were my brothers. This was my family. "Everything is perfect, Sergeant," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Thank you, all of you." He simply nodded, a gesture that conveyed more understanding and loyalty than a lifetime of hollow words from my blood relatives ever had. We got into our cars and drove away, leaving the silent, glittering country club behind for good. The next morning, my phone started to blow up. I woke to 17 missed calls from my mother, 10 from my father, and a string of increasingly frantic texts from Kevin. The first few from my parents were just my name with a question mark. Then came the demands. "Call me immediately. We need to talk about what you did. How could you embarrass us like that?" Kevin's were worse. They started with rage. "You ruined my wedding," and devolved into a kind of pleading confusion. "Who are you? What was all that?" They weren't apologies. They were accusations. They were the desperate, angry cries of people whose control had been stripped away, who couldn't comprehend a world where their narrative wasn't the only one that mattered. They still saw my actions as an attack on them, not as a direct consequence of their own. I read each message with a strange sense of detachment. The words had no power over me anymore. They were just pixels on a screen, the frantic signals of a sinking ship I was no longer on. The anger, the demands, the feigned concern, it all felt like it was happening to someone else. There was no part of me that wanted to explain, to justify, to argue. The time for that had passed decades ago. After reading the last vitriolic text from Kevin, I calmly went into my contacts. I found my mother's name, held my finger on the screen, and pressed block. I did the same for my father, and then for Kevin. The act was simple, quiet, and profoundly liberating. With 3 taps on a screen, I had erected a final, impenetrable wall. The war was over, and I had just signed the terms of my own unconditional surrender from their lives. A week later, I got a call from a cousin, Sarah, who had been a bridesmaid at the wedding. She spoke in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "You're all anyone is talking about, Mom," she said. "The party completely fell apart after you left. The band didn't know what to do. People just started leaving. Kevin and Tiffany had a massive, screaming fight right there on the dance floor. She told me Kevin kept yelling, 'He did this to me,' while his new bride was crying about how he had lied to her and her family about his own brother. Apparently, her father, the real estate mogul, was furious about the spectacle. Sarah said she doubted the marriage would last a year. It wasn't information I reveled in, but it was a quiet confirmation. A structure built on such a weak, deceitful foundation was never meant to stand for long. I never spoke to my parents or my brother again. Years have passed. I heard through the grapevine that Kevin and Tiffany did, in fact, divorce less than 2 years later. My parents, I'm told, never mentioned my name. To their friends and the rest of the family, it's as if they only ever had one son. And in a way, they're right. The son they knew, the one they had created to fit their narrative of failure, ceased to exist that night in the ballroom. He walked out those doors and never came back. I don't feel anger when I think of them now. I don't feel much of anything at all. They are just ghosts from a different life. A story about a young man who had to leave his family to find his home. My home is here. It's in the pre-dawn quiet of the barracks. in the shared trust of a mission briefing, in the steady, loyal gaze of men like Sergeant Davis. My life is not measured in stock options or luxury cars, but in the promises I keep to the soldiers under my command. My worth isn't determined by a family that chose to see me as small, but by the men who trust me to lead them when things are bigger than any of us. That night, I didn't just walk out of a wedding reception. I walked into my own life, free and clear. I reclaimed my name, my honor, and my future, and I did it without saying a single word. The silence, once their greatest weapon against me, had become my ultimate victory. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. What I learned from all this wasn't about revenge or getting even. You can spend your whole life trying to win a game that someone else designed. But the only way to truly win is to stop playing. For years, I was fighting for a seat at a table where I was never welcome, trying to earn the approval of people who had already decided who I was. The real lesson is that you can't force someone to see your worth. You can't argue them into respecting you. The moment you stop needing their validation is the moment you take back all your power. It's not about making them see the light. It's about realizing you don't need their light to see your own path. That freedom is more valuable than any inheritance or apology they could ever offer. It also taught me what the word family really means. It isn't always about blood. Sometimes, the people you share a last name with are the ones who know you the least. Real family are the people who see you for who you are right now and stand by you, not because they have to, but because they want to. They're the ones who have your back when it counts, who share your values, and whose respect is earned in the trenches of life, not handed out based on a job title or the size of your bank account. I found my family in the dust and the heat, among men who trusted me with their lives. Look around you. Your real family, your true unit, might be the people you've chosen, the ones who show up when the world tries to count you out. There's a profound strength in quiet dignity. For years, I thought I had to explain myself, to defend my choices, to list my accomplishments just to be seen. But what I discovered is that true strength doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to brag or put on a show. It's a quiet, steady presence. It's in the way you carry yourself, the integrity of your actions, and the unwavering belief in your own principles. The loudest people in the room are often the most insecure. They build themselves up by tearing others down. The truly strong build their foundation on something real, something internal, that no insult or joke can ever shake. Let your character speak for you. In the end, it's the only voice that truly matters. This whole experience forced me to redefine what success looks like. I was raised to believe it was a number in a bank account, a brand of car in the driveway, a zip code on an envelope, but that's a hollow victory. It's a scoreboard that someone else created. Real success is about purpose. It's about knowing why you get up in the morning. It's about being the kind of person others can rely on when everything goes wrong. It's the trust in the eyes of someone who depends on you. That's a currency you can't buy, and it's a wealth that no market crash can ever take away. Don't ever let someone else's definition of success make you feel small. Build a life of purpose, and you will be richer than they can ever imagine. Perhaps the most important lesson was the power of letting go. For so long, I carried their judgment around like a heavy rucksack. Every condescending comment, every dismissive glance was another stone I added to the bag. Walking away that night wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of liberation. It was me finally putting that bag down and walking away, free. You can't move forward if you're constantly looking back, hoping the people who hurt you will suddenly change. They won't. The peace comes when you accept that and turn your focus to your own journey. Forgiveness isn't always about them. Sometimes, it's about giving yourself permission to stop carrying the weight of their mistakes. Ultimately, your value is not a subject for debate. It is not up for a family vote. It is a fact you must know deep in your own bones. You have to be the primary authority on your own worth. When you build that certainty within yourself, the opinions of others become nothing more than noise. You stop reacting, you stop defending, because you are anchored to something solid and true inside of you. That night, their words couldn't touch me, because I finally knew without a shadow of a doubt who I was. I wasn't the person they saw. I was the man my soldiers saw, and that was enough. Build that certainty in yourself, and you will be untouchable. So, if you're out there feeling unseen, undervalued, or defined by someone else's small-minded story for you, I want you to know this. You hold the pen. You are the author of your own life. It doesn't matter what chapter they thought they were writing for you. You have the power to start a new one right now. Surround yourself with people who see your strength, live by a code that you believe in, and define success on your own terms. Your story is yours to write. Don't ever let anyone else hold the pen.